Olá a todos e todas, é um prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje. Vamos dar início a mais um painel da Conferência Ethos, no qual nós vamos discutir hoje sobre a regulamentação do lobby no Brasil. Eu sou Marina Ferro, sou gerente do Instituto Ethos, serei a moderadora aqui do nosso encontro, então gostaria de iniciar agradecendo a presença da audiência que nos assiste, da equipe de produção e a nossa intérprete, e também a nossa convidada especial hoje, a Pauline, que está aqui representando o CDE, então, portanto, uma convidada estrangeira, que nós teremos aqui a honra de tê-la conosco para debater esse tema em profundidade. A Pauline é especialista no tema de lobby, vem conduzindo aí uma série de iniciativas, então a gente vai ter a oportunidade de aprofundar bastante nesse tema, trazendo aí recomendações, princípios internacionais, para que a gente também pense nessa regulamentação aqui no Brasil. Como a nossa convidada é estrangeira, eu vou iniciar aqui o nosso diálogo fazendo uma rápida introdução em inglês, então vocês que nos assistem têm a oportunidade também de acompanhar o link com tradução, que consta aqui na descrição desse vídeo, então vocês podem escolher em qual língua assistir. E, bom, vou começar aqui então a falar com inglês. Thanks, Pauline, for joining us today for your participation here to discuss such an important issue. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. So before giving the word for you, I will just say a few words about the objective of our panel. And it is to have this dialogue on the importance of lobbying regulation in Brazil, bringing international and national principles and recommendations from the OECD. We believe at Ethos that the activity of defense of interests is an exercise of legitimate representation of private interests before the public power, and its regulation represents an important mechanism to improve the Brazilian national integrity system. Despite the negative connotation of lobbying activity that we have in Brazil and probably in other countries, especially due to the lack of regulation here in Brazil and its use for misappropriation, it is an important instrument of the democratic process based on the Article 5 of our federal constitution. The debate of the lobby regulamentation has once again gained traction with recurring disclosures of illegal and unethical relations between the public sector and the private sector in Brazil, such as those revealed in recent anti-corruption operations like the car wash and others. In the international scenario, we know that the lobbying regulation is a global trend in which several countries recognize this activity, understanding that there is a concern about the transparency of public-private relations. And in addition, I studied by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD that Pauline represents here today, on public integrity, recommends that the Brazilian government develop laws to regulate the lobby activity. Over the years, Ethos Institute has been monitoring the proposals and procedures on lobbying regulation in Brazil, and we participated in public hearings and elaborated several policy papers with recommendations and principles that should be taken into account for this kind of regulation. We analyzed the proposals presented so far together with companies and other civil society organizations, mainly because we believe that this regulation will be another important mechanism to combat corruption and promote greater transparency and integrity in public-private relations. In this sense, we are conducting a deep analysis together with the Ethos Working Group of the Business Pact for Integrity and Against Corruption. It's a group that gathers companies and other relevant actors, such as civil society, academy, among others, to elaborate an analysis of the bill from 2021 that is currently proceeding in the Labor Administration and Public Service Committee of the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil. This bill was authored by the Federal Executive Branch in an attempt to bring regulation for the private representation of interests made by natural or legal persons with public agents. So this dialogue with Pauline will certainly bring insights and thoughts that we should take into account for our positioning paper, the work that we have been conducting with companies. So we will start the panel and invite Pauline to present the initiatives that OECD have in this topic in terms of perceptions, recommendations, and international examples on the lobbying regulation. I will just quickly present Pauline and before inviting her to speak. So Pauline is a policy analyst in the Public Sector Integrity Directorate for Public Governance from the OECD. Pauline works on supporting governments in the design and implementation of policies that ensure public integrity and prevent corruption. She has expertise in strengthening integrity frameworks and promoting transparency and integrity in lobbying and political finance. Prior to joining the OECD, Pauline worked in business consulting and was a policy analyst at the French High Authority for Transparency in Public Life. A French national, Pauline holds a master's degree in international economic policy from Sciences Po and a dual bachelor degree in applied mathematics and social science from Sciences Po and University Paris Sorbonne. So for our first round, I will invite Pauline to tell us a little bit more about the OECD recommendation on principles for transparency and integrity in lobbying and the international perspective. Please, Pauline.
Thank you very much, Marina, and good evening from Paris. So as you mentioned, my name is Pauline Bertrand. I am a policy analyst at the OECD working on anti-corruption and integrity. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be with you today. And I would like to thank the Ethos Institute for the invitation to participate today. For this first part, this presentation, I have a few slides to share with you, and so I will talk about the OECD recommendation on principle for transparency and integrity in lobbying, and also the international perspective that can inform the debate on lobbying regulation in Brazil. Before I go into the points on lobbying I would like to share with you today, for those of you that are not familiar with the work of the OECD yet, a quick summary of what the OECD is and what we do. So the OECD is an international organization of 38 member countries in which governments work together to find policy solutions to common challenges such as climate change, international taxation, inequalities, and also corruption. And Brazil is one of the partner countries of the OECD. We do this by several means. So first, we provide comparative data and analysis to inform public policies. We also engage governments and we bring policymakers together to exchange ideas and good practices. And we also develop international standards so that everyone plays by the same rules. And based on these instruments, we then support our member countries in the design and implementation of public policies. In the field of anti-corruption and integrity, so we support governments in the implementation of policies that prevent corruption and also promote integrity. And because many corruption risk areas lie at the interface of the public sector and the private sector, the OECD has actually been playing a leading role in the past 2 decades on promoting transparency and integrity in lobbying. So this work that we do on lobbying is based on an OECD legal instrument called the OECD recommendation on principles for transparency and integrity in lobbying. So it's a recommendation, which means that it is not legally binding for our member countries, but it reflects the political will of our countries, and it provides guidelines on how to enhance transparency and integrity in lobbying. The recommendation recognizes that lobbying in all its forms is a natural part of the democratic process, and that it gives interested stakeholders access to public officials, to the policy-making process, and it enables them to to provide public officials with their needs, with evidence about different policy issues. And so it enables, as Marina mentioned, an inclusive decision-making process that can lead to better informed policies. So it is a very positive aspect and a legitimate activity, and the recommendation recognizes this. The recommendation was also one of the key responses of the OECD to the financial crisis, because at the time there was some evidence showing that dishonest and non-transparent lobbying was partly at the origin of the financial crisis. So that is why this recommendation was adopted, and it was actually the first international instrument that addressed the risk related to lobbying. And so the recommendation is built on 10 principles and 4 objectives. The first one about building an effective and fair framework for access to the decision-making process, the second one on enhancing transparency, the third one on fostering a culture of integrity, and the last one on creating mechanisms for effective implementation, compliance, and review. We monitor the implementation of this recommendation on a regular basis. And so in 2014, we published a first report that took stock of the how the recommendation was implemented in OECD member countries. So this is the report that you see on the right of the screen. And at the time, the review process that we did found that there was an emerging consensus on the need for more transparency and integrity in lobbying activities. In 2021, we published a second report. So this is a very recent report. And it's a report that also looks at how countries have implemented the principles of the recommendation. And it also is a report that looks into the emerging trends, risks, and challenges when it comes to lobbying. And actually, Brazil participated in the report. So we provided a questionnaire to the countries, and so Brazil provided answers to the questionnaire, and so the Brazil is featured in this report. So I will share with you a few of the key findings from the report, as well as some data that we gathered on the key trends and challenges, and also recommendations from the OECD in this report. The first key finding that we have in the report is that lobbying is more complex than the way it has been traditionally defined. We usually think of lobbying as, for example, a meeting with a private sector representative and a public official. But in the 21st century context, especially with the rise of social media, lobbying has become more complex than ever before, and that today the avenues by which stakeholders influence governments encompass a wide range of practices and actors, including direct lobbying, but also lobbying through lobbying firms, trade associations, industry associations, also contributions to political parties, candidates, electoral campaigns. And we see emerging a new set of practices. For example, we see increasingly that interest groups use social media as a lobbying tool. So they conduct social media campaigns, for example, to shape policy debates, to persuade members of the public, to put pressure on public officials. We see also increasingly companies or organizations that finance research, think tanks, also grassroots organizations as a means of influence. So in sum, we see that the lobbying landscape has become quite complex. The second trend that we identify in our report is that lobbying plays a central role, and often underestimated role, in the way that governments respond to major global challenges, and that depending on how they are conducted, lobbying activities can either greatly advance or block progress on these key global challenges. If we think of any policy area, for example, air pollution, the cost of our food, the content of our food, the amount of taxes we pay, these are government policies, and usually they are adopted after intense lobbying by those that have an interest in these issues. And we see many examples where lobbying can be beneficial for our societies. However, the evidence also shows that policymaking processes are not always inclusive, and that the abuse of lobbying practices can result in negative policy outcomes. For example, inaction on climate change, and this can indeed be detrimental to our societies and also undermine citizens' trust in democratic processes. And also we have seen that during the COVID-19 crisis, where some evidence showed that those groups that had more access to, for example, emergency measures or packages were sometimes groups that had better links to government officials or more powerful resources. The third finding that we have in the report is that we see that companies, especially, but also civil society organizations, are confronted with an amplified level of scrutiny from consumers, shareholders, even investors, who are demanding more transparency on the way these businesses conduct their lobbying activities, in particular when it comes to climate change. Why? This is because actually we have seen examples of companies who have been making very ambitious climate or sustainability pledges, but that behind closed doors have been lobbying, for example, against climate policies or have donated to candidates who were against strengthening climate-related regulations. So we see actually that there is an increased public pressure to improve transparency in lobbying. And so what we see, and this is the timeline that you see, is that countries are increasingly advancing in providing transparency and integrity in lobbying. The perspective from the OECD is that lobbying should not be restricted, but rather enabled, but as part of a legal framework where lobbying is clearly defined and there is transparency and integrity measures. And so the OECD really encourages a comprehensive approach to defining lobbying. And we see on this timeline that at the OECD level, we have 22 countries that have adopted a lobbying regulation that provides some level of transparency on lobbying. A majority of these countries do this through what we call a lobbying register, where, for example, lobbyists have to register and disclose their activities. So this is, for example, the case in the United States, in Canada, in France, Ireland, also Chile. Other countries provide transparency in lobbying through requiring public officials, for example, to publish their meetings with lobbyists. So this is an alternative but complementary approach. So we see that more and more countries are adopting lobbying regulation. But when we look actually deeply into these lobbying regulation, we still see that the levels of transparency are not entirely adequate. For example, if we look at lobbying definitions in countries, we see that they don't always cover all actors. For example, we have regulations in the OECD. They do not cover NGOs as lobbyists. So they only focus on companies. And so as a result, not all actors are included in the regulation. And so the level of transparency is not really on all actors. Similarly, when we look at the kind of information that is being made transparency, we see that usually lobbying disclosures focus on who is conducting lobbying activities. This graph shows actually that about half of OECD countries provide transparency on who is conducting and on whose behalf the lobbying activities are being conducted. However, there is much less transparency on the target of lobbying activities. So what is being lobbied? If we look at this graph, we see that few countries actually require lobbyists to disclose which specific legislation, proposal, or regulation was targeted by their activities. And so we see that there is limited transparency on really what the objective of the lobbying activity is. And lastly, there is also very little transparency on how lobbying is being done. So we have very few countries that actually require the disclosure of what techniques were used. And for example, I mentioned earlier the fact that increasingly social media is being used as a lobbying tool. Well, we see that at the OECD level, only 2 countries explicitly require transparency over social media campaigns being used as lobbying tool. This is the case in Canada, where lobbyists need to disclose how they did their lobbying. And part of this includes what the Canadian law calls grassroots lobbying. So this refers to any campaign that is done to influence public debate, so that citizens put pressure on decision makers. So this is sometimes referred to as indirect lobbying. So this is covered in Canada, and it is also covered at the European level. So we actually see that very few countries cover these types of activities. And I will finish my presentation with this graph. This refers to more about integrity standards. So here we talk about, for example, code of conduct for lobbyists or any standards of behavior for lobbyists. And here we see that this is also missing at the OECD level, where we see that actually few countries provide standards for lobbyists on the kind of behavior that they are allowed to have when they interact with public officials. And actually the OECD recommends in general to have these standards for lobbyists, but also a public official, in addition to transparency. So in sum, I would say that to sum up our report, that the lobbying landscape has changed a lot in the past 20 years, that we have seen increasing digitalization, and so the use of digital tools as lobbying. And this is redefining lobbying regulations, lobbying and the way it is being regulated by countries, and that more and more countries are regulating lobbying, and many actually countries are currently discussing lobbying laws. So this is the case, for example, in Brazil, where there have been several bills, but also we have similar discussions in Costa Rica, in Spain, in Malta. So we have actually many more countries that will also adopt lobbying regulations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pauline, for this great first overview. I think this presentation of yours, it's very good for everyone to understand what this means in a global manner. And for our next rounds, I will invite you to answer a few questions. So I'll start now asking about, you mentioned that lobbying is more complex than the way it has been traditionally defined in regulations, usually as a direct communication between a lobbyist and a public official. So how can we conceptualize the activity of defense of interests or lobbying today? We also often hear the word advocacy. So if you could please tell us, the audience, what is the difference between an advocacy, if any?
Yes, thank you for this question. So indeed, as I have mentioned, usually when we think of lobbying, we traditionally think of, well, a direct communication between a public official and a lobbyist, whether it be a meeting, a phone call, or a written exchange. But as I have mentioned, because of the rise of social media, we see that lobbying is actually changing in nature, and that we have many actors and many lobbying techniques that are involved. And I mentioned that lobbyists are increasingly using social media campaigns to influence people, and so that people also would then influence their elected representatives. So this is indirect lobbying, and we see this happening more and more. And because of this complexity, we see that lobbying is also perceived in a negative way. I think this is the case in Brazil, but also this is a challenge in many OECD countries, where we see that the word lobbying also is associated with opaque activities or sometimes illegal activities. And so some interest groups use an alternative word that you said, the word advocacy. And the word advocacy is commonly used to describe the activities of organizations that defend a particular cause and who actually influence the policymaking process in defense of a specific cause or idea or ideology, as opposed to lobbying that is often more referred to as a company defending a specific point of view on a specific decision. So advocacy is more used on defending a specific cause or idea, and also on issues that really affect citizens' everyday lives. And at the OECD, what we usually say is that lobbying and advocacy are the same, because if we differentiate the two, this leads to the perception that there is good lobbying and bad lobbying. And usually the good lobbying is associated with the words advocacy and civil society organizations, and bad lobbying is then more referred to in reference to companies and the way they influence. And this is something that we would like to avoid, because if we think about the two concepts, they actually have a similar goal. The goal is really to influence the policymaking process. And so if the goal is really to influence whether it is in favor of a cause or for a specific company, then we say that this is lobbying. So at the OECD, we really encourage companies to adopt a broad view of the issue and to adopt lobbying definitions that are as inclusive as possible. So they include not only companies, so for-profit organizations, but also not-for-profit organizations, so NGOs, research centers, even think tanks, and so that we don't make a difference between lobbying and advocacy. And in our report, we have adopted a lobbying definition. It is actually quite large, and I will read it to you. So the OECD now refers to lobbying as the act of lawfully attempting to influence the design, the implementation, the execution, and the evaluation of public policies and regulations administered by executive, legislative, or judicial public officials at the local, regional, or national level. So this is quite a large definition, But this is usually what we recommend to countries to avoid any loopholes.
Great, Pauline. I think this difference of concepts generates a lot of debate here in Brazil and elsewhere, as you said. So I think you approached it and explained very well for us. And I would like also to ask you on this matter, going a little bit back about your first presentation. What is the real importance and influence of lobbying for society as a whole? You mean you gave some examples about the policy-making process, for instance, for the sustainable goals for development and how the lobby can influence on that. So do you have examples of when lobbying is beneficial or detrimental to the societal interests of the general public?
Yes, sure. I mean, as you mentioned in your initial presentation, lobbying is really, and this is also the position of the OECD, lobbying is part of democracy. There is no democracy without lobbying, and that lobbying has been part of public life for at least 2 centuries, and it is really a legitimate activity because it allows different stakeholders to voice their interests. Whether they're companies, NGOs, they can really share their experience, their expertise, and also their needs to public officials. So this is really a positive trend. And as I have mentioned, lobbying can be beneficial to our societies. If we take, for example, lobbying for green cars or lobbying for legislation against child abuse, or lobbying to increase competition between sectors. These are positive examples in which lobbying can benefit not only those that defend the interests, but also society as a whole, where society benefits from this influence, this positive influence. However, and I have mentioned it, increasingly evidence shows that the abuse of lobbying practices can result in negative policy outcomes. One of the most famous and actually documented example that we have is the influence of the tobacco industry, which starting in the 1950s conducted what I would call deceitful lobbying practices, where they funded research that denied the link between smoking and cancer. And they, as a result, weakened the scientific consensus against smoking, and they delayed by several years and even decades the adoption of regulations on tobacco. And so this is a very documented examples of where lobbying can lead to negative policy outcomes. I mentioned also the financial crisis, where we have evidence that non-transparent lobbying, that institutions in the financial sector lobbying for deregulation, for example, in the financial markets, were partly at the origin of the financial crisis. So all of these examples, and I also cited the example of climate change, show that lobbying can block or delay progress on key issues. And this is the case in any country. So thus the relevance of adopting policies that provide more transparency and integrity on these practices.
Perfect. Thanks for these examples. I think this also helps a lot to clarify for the audience. And you mentioned during your presentation that the OECD recommends countries to strengthen transparency and lobbying activities. Given this, why is there a need to regulate lobbying? What are the advantages of regulating lobbying, and what can be the impacts of non-regulation of this activity?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think we partly answered the question with the previous one, where we saw examples where lobbying creates risks for the policymaking process, a risk where only the most powerful interests are voiced, or risks of lobbying activities being abused, for example, through the provision of biased data or evidence. So here, this is where the relevance of lobbying regulation enters, because they provide transparency, but also integrity on how these activities are conducted, and so they help prevent these risks that we just mentioned. And also, one of the big advantages that I would like to highlight is that lobbying regulation, they create a framework for lobbying. They define what lobbying is. And we have seen in countries that do not have a lobbying regulation, they do not have a lobbying definition. And so this leaves the room for interpretations. And we mentioned the word advocacy, where some people use alternative words. And because the word lobbying is not clear, then it is usually seen negatively. When a lobbying regulation is adopted, this gives a clear framework. So the word lobbying is defined, and lobbyists have a framework in which they can conduct their activities. They know what they are allowed to do, what they are not allowed to do, and they disclose information on the lobbying activities they are conducted. And so this is really a very big advantage and benefits of lobbying regulation. And we have seen in countries, for example, Ireland, that adopted a regulation in 2015, so 7 years ago. We have many lobbyists, including companies and CSOs, that said, well, actually, lobbying regulation was very beneficial for us. It did not have an impact on our activities. We were able to continue lobbying, but it actually gave us legitimacy, because our activities were at last recognized in the legal framework. So this is also one advantage of lobbying regulation that I wanted to highlight today.
Great. Yeah, now that we explored the importance of the lobby regulation and all its advantage for the policy-making process and for the democratic process, you gave one example now that I would like to ask you. If you can share with us what are the main challenges for lobbying regulation, and also good examples such as this that you just taught us, of legislations worldwide that help to improve the integrity system of countries while reducing corruption and bringing more transparency.
Sure, so I will give 3 key challenges and then 3 examples of strong regulations across the OECD. Among the 3 challenges I would like to highlight, the first one, I talked to it a little bit, but it's really about providing the right definition for lobbying and disclosing the right amount of information. Because what constitutes the right amount of information is not always easy. And when it comes to lobbying regulation, the objective is not necessarily to make the whole process transparent, but really to disclose information that is relevant for citizens and stakeholders. So one of the key challenges is to have an inclusive definition of lobbying that covers all actors, including companies and NGOs, and also that covers all activities. So not just direct communications between lobbyists and public officials, but also, for example, the use of social media as a lobbying tool. So this is key to have really a broad definition, and also to have a transparency framework that allows to disclose what I mentioned, who is lobbying, on what, so the specific decision that was targeted, and also how the lobbying was conducted. So these are the kind of relevant information that we recommend countries to address in the regulation. Another key challenges is also the issue of compliance and enforcement, because we can have strong transparency framework, but if there is no compliance, then the transparency does not achieve its objectives. So it's actually key that countries, when they adopt lobbying regulations, they also in the law provide for an oversight function that will, for example, check the content of the lobbying information. Also, that the oversight function has sufficient powers and resources to verify the lobbying information, and that it can also apply relevant sanctions. Sanctions are important for effective compliance and enforcement. And the third key challenge, I would say, is really about designing effective and user-friendly online tools where citizens can access to lobbying information. We need, when it comes to lobbying regulations, to have really well-constructed online platforms where citizens can easily go and check the information and also identify what are the key trends when it comes to lobbying. And so this is a challenge in many countries where some countries do not have very user-friendly online portals, and this affects transparency. So these are the three challenges I wanted to highlight, and now I will highlight three good or strong regulations. So one in Europe, one in North America, and one in South America. The first country that I would like to highlight is, I mentioned it, Ireland. So Ireland adopted a Regulation of Lobbying Act in 2015, and the act is overseen by an independent institution called the Standards in Public Office Commission. And the act has a strong definition of lobbying because it covers any company or NGO that seeks to influence public officials on a policy issue. And so these lobbyists need to register in an online register of lobbyists. So they need to register any meeting they have with public officials, any letters they send, any emails, or even tweets that they send to public officials. And this covers public officials such as ministers, members of parliament, and senior officials in the public administration. And what is very strong about this regulation is really the transparency, because the information that is made public is quite comprehensive. So when lobbyists register, they need to disclose who is lobbying and on whose behalf, the issues that are involved in the lobbying activities, and also the public official that was targeted. And finally, the intended result of the activity. So this is quite strong information, and the Lobbying Act in Ireland is one of the strongest regulation in Europe. And as I have mentioned, it was actually very welcomed by lobbyists themselves, who mentioned that the act really enabled them to have a framework in which they could conduct their activities. The second regulation I would like to highlight is Canada, which was one of the first countries actually to regulate lobbying. I think it was regulated first in 1989 through a specific law as well. And one of the key advantages of this law, again, is that it has a broad definition of lobbying. So it covers lobbying by companies, also by NGOs, and also, as I mentioned, it covers written communications oral communications, and also what the Act calls grassroots communications, which is any attempt to influence the public so that the public then influences public officials. So this is quite a strong definition, and also there is a very good transparency portal where citizens can access lobbying information online, and also lobbyists need to update and to disclose information on lobbying every month. So this means that the register is really up to date. And lastly, Canada has also a lobbying code of conduct for lobbyists. So this gives also an integrity framework for lobbyists when they conduct their activities. And last regulation that I would like to highlight, that is also cited as a good practice in our lobbying report, is Chile. Chile has adopted a lobbying law in 2014. And this law is a bit different than the law in Canada and Ireland, because it is public officials who have to register their meetings with lobbyists. So it's not lobbyists who have to disclose, it's actually public officials. And so one of the key advantages of the regulation in Chile is the online portal that is called Info Lobby. And it gathers really all the lobbying information with infographics and relevant information. So it's actually very easy to access the lobbying information online. And the transparency portal is administered by the Consejo para la Transparencia, so the Transparency Council of Chile. So this is also quite a strong regulation in South America. So these are the three examples I wanted to highlight today.
Great, Pauline. I think these were very good examples, and we can learn a lot about them. We can try to bring what, the different characteristics that each of these models has, and try to improve our own system, thinking about what makes more sense in our political system. And for our final round, final question and your final words, I would like to ask you about the OECD conducting an integrity review of Brazil nowadays, and would like to know if the OECD will make formal recommendations on the regulation of lobbying in Brazil.
Yes, absolutely. So actually, I mentioned that Brazil participated to a lobbying report, and the report is accessible online. We can make the link available later on, but you can type lobbying in the 21st century, transparency, integrity, and access, and you will find a report that includes all the examples I've mentioned, but also a detailed comparative analysis. So you can access this report online. With regards to Brazil, indeed, so lobbying remains unregulated in Brazil, though there have been bills being discussed, and also currently there is a new bill that has been proposed and that is under discussion. You mentioned it, Marina. So the OECD is currently conducted what we call an integrity review of Brazil. So this will be a comprehensive report of the integrity system in Brazil. And we are going to look into lobbying regulation in Brazil. So we will do a very in-depth analysis of the current lobbying bill in Brazil. We will also conduct interviews with different stakeholders, including companies, think tanks, civil society organizations, to also gather their views on the main strengths and weaknesses of the proposed bill. And at the end of this process, we will be able to give tailored formal recommendations to Brazil on how Brazil should provide strengthened transparency and integrity in lobbying. And the recommendations that we will make will also be based on international best practices that we just talked about today. So at this stage, it is too early for me to give any indication of where the law stands or the strengths and weaknesses of the law. But this is a process that is ongoing, and we very much look forward to present these recommendations publicly in the next few months when the report on Brazil is ready. And in the meantime, we are, of course, very happy to contribute to dialogue and debates on lobbying regulation in Brazil. And I wanted to thank you again, Marina, for this very interesting conversation, and to thank the Ethos Institute for the invitation. It's always a pleasure for us to contribute to the dialogue on strengthening transparency and integrity in lobbying. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline. It's an honor for us to have you here. I think this for us was kind of a lecture, and I'm sure that for the audience as well, for those who want to know a little bit better or understand what means to regulate lobby, what are the benefits and why it's detrimental, and what are the best practice worldwide. So I think this was very comprehensive and very good for all of us. And we will also use some of the recommendations and principles that you brought here for our work with companies. So we are also at your disposal to contribute in this review if you want. And as we have not a lot of time, I will end our panel. Thank you for your participation again. If you like the conversation, you can leave your likes, your comment, and subscribe to the Ethos Institute channel so we can receive notifications and follow the chats. All content is available in the Ethos Conference 2022 playlist. So thanks again, Pauline, and I hope to see you soon and to continue our dialogue in other places. Okay.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you to everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Inovação, excelência e governança guiam o Axê. Farmacêutica mais inovadora do Brasil e líder em prescrição médica. O Axê leva à sociedade soluções inovadoras para contribuir com tratamentos seguros e eficazes. A excelência operacional está incorporada em todas as plantas. Em Pernambuco, estamos aptos a inspeções internacionais, EMA, FDA. Os resultados consistentes ao longo dos anos demonstram a força, a solidez e a perenidade da companhia, além da sua capacidade de gerar valor para o negócio, para o meio ambiente e para a sociedade. Acreditamos que muitos podem ter suas vidas transformadas pelo que fazemos e seguimos cumprindo nosso propósito de levar mais vida às pessoas, onde quer que elas estejam. Axê, mais vida para você.
A transformação dos minerais está na essência dos objetos e do modo de vida contemporâneo. A mineração produz a matéria-prima presente em quase todos os produtos que utilizamos hoje e que vamos fabricar no futuro. E para a Anglo-América, a mineração existe para melhorar a vida das pessoas em todos os sentidos. No Brasil, produzimos minério de ferro em Minas Gerais e níquel em Goiás. Em 2014, o Sistema Minas Rio foi inaugurado. Essa operação integra todas as etapas: lavra, beneficiamento, transporte por mineiroduto e embarque no Porto do Açu. Em Goiás, temos operações nas cidades de Barro Alto e Niquelândia, onde produzimos ferro-níquel, material utilizado para a fabricação de aços inoxidáveis. Temos como meta sermos líderes globais em mineração sustentável. Isso significa, por exemplo, sermos uma empresa que colabora com a construção de comunidades prósperas, com foco em educação e saúde, e com um meio ambiente saudável, buscando reduzir o uso de água e as emissões de carbono nas operações. E assim, com compromisso e transparência, oportunidades e possibilidades de crescimento são criadas para todos os municípios e regiões que hospedam nossas operações. Anglo-American, mineração e pessoas que fazem a diferença.
Todos os dias, criamos embalagens infinitamente recicláveis e contribuímos de diferentes formas para a sustentabilidade ambiental, social e econômica do planeta. Grande parte dessa contribuição está na forma como tratamos uns aos outros, porque na Ball somos uma só família. Ball, líder na fabricação de latas de alumínio sustentáveis.
A gente não consegue acelerar o tempo, mas podemos acelerar ainda mais as nossas ações, usando o tempo que nós temos hoje para transformar o futuro. Por isso, a Braskem, alinhada com os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável da ONU para 2030, assumiu novos compromissos com as pessoas e com o planeta. Trabalhando em 7 dimensões diferentes, temos muitas metas para os próximos anos. Entre elas, a eliminação de resíduos plásticos, a ampliação do portfólio I'm Green, nosso plástico feito de material renovável e reciclado, a promoção da diversidade, equidade e inclusão e a neutralização das nossas emissões de gás carbônico até 2050 para combatermos as mudanças climáticas. Vamos transformar o mundo em um lugar mais sustentável para todos, deste tempo e dos próximos. Braskem, um futuro mais sustentável hoje.
A Hydro é líder industrial que constrói negócios e parcerias para um futuro mais sustentável. Desenvolvemos indústrias que fazem a diferença para as pessoas e para a sociedade. Transformamos recursos naturais em produtos e negócios relevantes para as pessoas, em um local de trabalho seguro e protegido para nossos 34 mil empregados em mais de 40 países. No Brasil, estamos presentes em toda a cadeia do alumínio, com a extração da bauxita, refino da alumina e a fabricação do alumínio primário no Pará, e as fábricas de extrusão em São Paulo e Santa Catarina. A Hydro está comprometida em liderar o setor na criação de um futuro mais sustentável, criando sociedades mais viáveis ao desenvolver recursos naturais em produtos e soluções de maneiras inovadoras e eficientes.
At Heineken, we are all brewers at heart. To brew is something rather special. We bring together natural ingredients under the perfect conditions and transform them into something the world loves. As brewers, we also bring people together. We've always believed the best moments in life are those we share with others. Passion, enjoyment, and respect are in our DNA. But we want to be equally great at making a positive impact in a world that is facing huge challenges. Climate change, water scarcity, inequality, poverty. Over the past decade, together with our extended family, we have worked to brew a better world. We've made considerable progress, but in the coming decade, we want to raise the bar even higher, setting ourselves on a path to carbon neutrality across our value chain, maximize circularity, and replenishing the water we consume where it matters most. We will brew a culture that embraces inclusion and diversity, foster a workplace that is both fair and safe, and support communities where we can make a difference. And we will continue to advocate for moderation, address the harmful use of alcohol, and offer 0.0 alternatives so people always have a choice. At Heineken, we know that while ambitions inspire us, it's our actions that define us. We are brewers and doers. Our journey requires the very best ingredients, our people and partners. We invite you to join us in raising the bar for a responsible, fairer, and healthier society. Together, we will brew a better world. Cheers to that.